Craft Brew Alliance, Team H, Jonathan Zhao, Austin Tolchin, Taylor Manley, and Ahana Delwar. So the agenda for this PowerPoint, first, we're going to talk about who is Craft Brew Alliance from a kind of high level view of them. What is their current financial state? Where are they currently in their financial model? How does their current financial state compare to a more mature company? And how can the company sustain growth / mature into a value company? So who is Craft Beer Alliance? They are headquartered in Portland, Oregon. They are the 5th largest craft brew company in the United States. They were formed in 2008, so a relatively new company that was launched during the kind of front end of the '08 financial crisis. They buy a variety of craft brews and then operate each independently, making for a complex business model. Essentially, this means they buy different manufactured beers and then sell them kind of all under their umbrella, that is Craft Beer Alliance. The financials are audited by Moss Adams LLP, which is a smaller firm. So comparison against Boston Beer Company. Boston Beer Company is surprisingly in Boston, Massachusetts. They're the top 5 largest distributor of domestic beer and recently cider in the United States. Sell 60 different Samuel Adams products. So obviously Samuel Adams is a very widespread beer that many are familiar with. And they also recently launched Angry Orchard, which has had more success in the cider industry than any other of these large distributors of beer. They've been around for over 20 years. They're a very mature company and their financials show that. And they're audited by E&Y.
So to give you a look at the industry, the beer industry in the United States is dominated by 2 major players, and those would be AB InBev and Miller Coors. These are 2 of the largest beer distributors in the world, and they account for over 85% of U.S. domestic beer sales, not including imports. This being said, recently in the last 10 years, a shift has been taking place in the beer industry. There's been a growth of craft beer relative to the major beer players that have been in place as a staple for a long time. Recently, the craft beer growth rate has been growing drastically and it's been catching up to and exceeding oftentimes the growth rate of light beer and regular beers that we're used to. The amount of craft beer manufacturers grew almost 4 times in a span of 9 years. And these firms are characterized by a lot of sales and general administrative and overhead expenses, and they often operate with low margins. So the key value drivers here to be focused on for Craft Beer Alliance would be they have to create synergies between their brick and mortar stores. So they operate these small pubs in various locations, and they also have to bring the synergies between these pubs and their distribution network of beer. Their pubs generate roughly 12% of their sales, but they also account for roughly 12% of cost of goods sold. This being said, it ends up being a drag on their net income because they still have to operate these and incur expenses after cost of goods sold. So they're looking to create synergies and enhance their brand name and potentially reach better margins from these brick and mortar stores. They have about 50% of their employees working in these pubs, and on an expense basis, their margins on their beer production are being suppressed by these high general administrative expenses, accounting for almost a quarter of their revenues, as well as their cost of goods sold, which account for between 60 and 70% of their total revenues. If they are to really extract value from this company moving forward as they keep growing, they're going to need to work on improving these margins and hopefully scaling their costs with increased productions. Furthermore, they've been investing heavily into growing the business, and the way these investments play out are really going to drive the future of this company. If they do play out, they have an opportunity to become a big market player, but if they don't play out, it's not looking good for this firm. So here are the characteristics between both of these companies. You can characterize Craft Beer Alliance as an early growth stage company, whereas Boston Beer Company is a later value company. They've been in business for much longer. And so when you're in a growth phase, oftentimes your operating cash flows are going to be low, whereas you're going to be investing more to grow the business and capital expenditures. And because you're doing this, your free cash flow is going to be low in comparison to a company that's already built out. Furthermore, you're not going to pay dividends because you're going to be saving that money to invest back into your business instead of paying your shareholders like an established, mature firm would do. Contrast this with a value firm that's been in business for a while. They often have high operating cash flows because they've already figured out their margin issues during the growth phase. They're not going to be investing as much into their business. They're going to be trying to pay that out to their investors in the form of dividends because of their high free cash flows.
So when calculating ROE, the Boston Brewing Company has a clear advantage here. They have a 21.08% ROE, which is well above if you assume a 10% cost of equity. That means that essentially they're going to generate free cash flow year over year. Whereas Craft Brew Alliance, has a very low ROE. And this is kind of explained by what we just talked about in terms of the operating cash flows being lower in the early stages of the business cycle. Typically, they won't have extreme kind of free cash flow and a high ROE in the early stages because they're using the majority of their cash on hand to fund new projects and hopefully grow their ROE in the future. So in a sense, they are taking kind of a lower ROE now to obtain a higher one at a later date.
So when evaluating the Craft Brew Alliance, there's a few ways that the future for them could play out. But if things were to go well for them, that would happen because of these value drivers that we mentioned earlier going properly. So if this were to be the case, they will be able to establish their new brands by gaining traction in the marketplace through both their pubs and their distribution network. Furthermore, by getting synergies between the two with their brands and their pubs to be able to scale this venture in a way that would lower their overhead costs for the pubs, no longer making it a drag on their net income, and in lowering their cost of distribution. Furthermore, they have a partnership with AB InBev, and if this relationship were to expand, bringing them more revenue and more sales, this would definitely help their bull case scenario. If their government regulations were to soften in the forms of the excise tax being lowered or in general lessened, this would really help because from their top line, they immediately pay tax on their products because alcohol is a highly taxed item. And the way this tax flows is not from the before tax income. It comes straight out of revenue from the top line. And finally, their bull case is going to be supported by their investments that they've been taking on, paying off in the forms of lower costs, better recognition for their brands, and higher returns because of their scaled business and synergies developed between their pubs and distribution. Contrast this to a scenario where things do not go as planned. A scenario where Craft Brew would not be doing as they intend to do currently with their investments. They wouldn't be able to make inroads from their investments in new brands. Perhaps these brands don't take off as they expected them to, or they end up paying more than their brands end up being worth after a while. If their margins from the distribution partnership were to decrease, this would definitely not help them grow as a company, but would in fact deepen their woes as a growing company. If the company were to have their investments in pubs not generate them enough net income to the point where it's no longer a good investment, this would definitely support a bearish scenario for this company. Furthermore, if their general administrative expenses continue to, or if they were to continue not scaling with their operations, this would not help them take the next step into a value company over time. Their prosperity definitely depends on increasing their margins, and their general administration expenses will not support this if they continue to rise. Furthermore, if there were to be a slowdown in the growth of the craft beer industry relative to standard or light beers, this would not help their business whatsoever. They rely on the growth of the craft beer industry in America, and if this were to not be happening or continue to go as it has been growing, this would also not help them in their quest to grow as a company. If government regulations on alcohol were to tighten instead of stay the same or get looser, this would also hurt their margins, as I mentioned previously, because their government excise tax comes off of their top line. And if they're unable to develop these synergies between their beer brands and pubs, that is also not going to help them in the future.
So the price in each of these cases that we just discussed, for Craft Brew Alliance would be $67 per share in the base case and $5.30 for Boston Brewing. And as you see, each of these kind of has we implied a growth rate, which can be found at the end of this PowerPoint, and applied it to each of the cash flows, and then just counted it back at the historical rate of 10% for each. And we use the residual income model using 3 cash flows and then the terminal value. Some advantages and disadvantages. So disadvantages and threats: regulation, enhanced excise tax, heavily relies on craft beer growth. We've kind of discussed a few of these items, but if the TBB were to enhance the excise tax, for instance, that would really impact the company in the long run. And then advantages and opportunities. There's a lot of value in using Anheuser-Busch's distribution network because they're scalable and they can eventually access cheaper capital. And given that the company is in the early stages, there's a lot of uncertainty, especially given that even the industry that they're in, the craft beer industry, is also in the early stages. It's clouded with uncertainty. Operating versus investing statement of cash flows. So kind of just looking at the historicals here. As you can see, their investing cash was always over the last 3 years greater than their operating cash, which is again, as we talked about earlier, with the kind of model that younger companies have, this is to continue, that will most definitely be problematic. So kind of just looking at them side by side. So Boston Brew mature, whereas Craft Brew is very young. Boston Brew Company has a larger scale, therefore they're able to access cheaper capital and have a higher ROE, whereas Craft Brew is very small scale. The difference in actual products, so you have domestic beer that we're all familiar with for the most part, and then you have craft beer, which is pretty a niche market. And then Boston Brew has historically had success and well known. They don't have to, although they do, they don't SG&A, whereas Craft Brew, for instance, has all these pubs and whatnot to really get their name out there. Some financial ratios, obviously, Boston Brew Company, their current ratio, they are a lot more liquid, and they have a better solvency ratio. They have less debt relative to equity compared to Craft Brew, which is pretty standard given that Craft Brew is so young. In their operating margin, which is kind of one of the key value drivers we discussed, they're not really, their operating cash flows are not necessarily really performing at so in conclusion, Craft Brew Company will have success if they can increase their operating margins, reduce SG&A and COGS, which is obviously part of operating margins. They can spread their footprint. They would do this through pubs and just getting their name out there, becoming more kind of well-known throughout the industry. Generate free cash flow off current capital expenditures, so return on new invested capital. That will be very important as the company is spending so much on their investing activities and so little on their financing activities. And then lastly, the craft beer market continues. It's gone up substantially year over year, but it's kind of this company is entirely reliant on kind of that systematic risk of the system and their product necessarily, although it may be unique in a sense, it is also a part of this kind of newer developing market. So, and here are calculations. We've also attached a spreadsheet, or 2 spreadsheets, and thank you very much for your time.